Hey, I'm going to get right into it. 1984 just was not my favorite book that I've read this year. Um, Among the several dystopian novels that I've had to read over the years from school and stuff like that, it just wasn't uh, what I expected, I guess. And I think that probably also it's to do with my own taste changing. I don't really get into dystopian fiction. Uh, but there's this one big reason that 1984 to me just did not work. And it wasn't so much the writing style, obviously. It wasn't really Orwell himself or his opinions. I know he kind of purposefully made the different ideologies in the book sort of vague. The big thing that stuck out to me is just very ill, something that didn't work out in the long run, as we've seen the 20th century and the 21st century unfold, is his idea that the 2 plus 2 making 4 would somehow be a groundbreaking truth under ideological oppression, and that's just not the case. It's not the case in America, and it's really not the case in most of the countries or regimes that we consider to be strictly dystopian, strictly tyrannical. And that's for a myriad of reasons. One of the big reasons is that we just are, especially in the West, we really do rely a lot on science, regardless of ideology. I know there's some discrepancies between, say, Democrats and Republicans about like where life might begin, and there's some there's some fringes on both sides of the spectrum who will argue, one vehemently against and one vehemently for the idea of the earth being flat. I say only the fringes because most people in the middle just do not care what you think about that. But that was a huge break in the world building for me, is this idea that somehow it would matter what was factually had happened. Really, it's the ideological interpretation of what's happened in history, for events that we know happened, and the ability for educational systems to either glaze over things or create a curriculum in order to absorb things that we know are wrong into our worldview and make it so that those things not only don't stand out particularly, but also are just perfectly not normalized really, but are enveloped sort of into a curriculum, into an educational system in a way that makes it so that the impact of the reality of that event is so much lessened and doesn't allow for any attachment to current ideas, current ideology, current governmental or economic circumstances. At least in America, I know a lot about American education. I know a little bit because I was born here, but I know that much, that it just did not pan out, at least with facts and like basic scientific facts being a huge critical part of subversion or anti-subversion in our day. We know that for a fact. That's why Aldous Huxley's book, Brave New World, I know most people consider that to be much more relevant than 1984, at least past a certain time period. It definitely seemed to be more strike a little bit more true, at least under capitalism. So that's one, not so much beef that I have, but something that I did notice just didn't pan out. But to go back beyond that, or to go back ahead of that, I want to say that as a preface, that's not a critique against Orwell or saying that he was just not all there when he put that into his book. He was working from a context in 1949 when he published the book. That was, just after the war. The people were still having their food rationed to them, even in countries like Great Britain, which won the war. And so the idea that the world would continue into a cycle after World War I, followed, just a couple decades later by World War II, I'm sure that the idea of continuous war without end, and the idea that that regimes would continue to stifle all forms of counterculture was very relevant for his time. He was living under a part of history where every government especially the Allies, just as much as the Axis powers, were operating under in very fascist circumstances, if that makes sense. They were operating in such a way as to close off all access to alternative forms of or alternative news, alternative political opinions about at least the nation one lived in. It was considered to be not only stupid or wrong to be non-patriotic or to be against the war. It was obviously considered non-patriotic, but it was also considered to be just a cowardly thing to be against anything that was going on. It was just moral wrongdoing to go against anything that Great Britain, America, Italy, Germany, Russia, name it, to go against what they were deciding to do. Their place in the war was kind of ideological suicide. It was ideological suicide to allow anybody to do that and to get away with it without severe moral, social reprimand. That would be reinforced by all the people around you, So, it makes more sense that in 1949 the world would be assumed to be like that in just about 30 years or so, because of what Orwell had lived through. Now, to take it a further step back from that to more personal circumstances in Orwell's life, one of the things that sticks out to me reading this book, which I'll say right now, I got like more than 3/4 of the way through before I decided it's not really worth me finishing. I'm just going to do the Cliff Notes. I get it. It's sad. Everybody loses in the end. I think after a certain point, you're like, okay, it's not going to get better for the hero. Let's just get on with it. But to go back to that aspect, the plot, the characters, all the wonderful world of Orwell that you've got going on in this book, take a step back. A lot of his initial idea for that seems to probably have come from him having read C.S. Lewis's, this is going to sound crazy, C.S. Lewis's last installment of his space trilogy. That's a mouthful already if you don't know about that. Just a quick explanation. C.S. Lewis, he wrote a lot of children's books, I know, but he also wrote adult fiction throughout his life. Most of his life he was writing adult fiction with a Christian ideological slant. The third and final installment of a space trilogy, which he did, actually has, instead of it being about going to space, it's an intrigue plot about nefarious forces taking over the Earth, or Britain, and it fails. The plan fails in that book, so it's like you don't get to come to 1984. But when you read that and you read Orwell's introduction, I think he either did an introduction or a review of the book. Don't quote me. He definitely read the book in full. He really appreciated a lot of it. So he made a nod to it in one of the papers, I know, or the Times or something like that, just to give a little review or an introduction or whatever it was. And so you can see the similarities immediately. There's actual character. There's definite similarity in the fact that both of those plots involved a romance. The first one, of course, is C.S. Lewis. It's about a kind of failing marriage that becomes stronger through the book. Orwell, of course, being a pessimist, and I feel like maybe a kind of a lonely guy. It was a guy who has very repressed, terrible feelings about this woman he works with, who, they have an affair, and then it all goes south. It's all bad. So, of course, there's similarity as much as you can find it there. And then you have, in C.S. Lewis's intrigue, almost dystopian novel, you have certain characters who are kind of bounced back and reflected and changed around in Orwell's book. You also have a lot of the themes, the idea about like children and, for some reason, women specifically being the biggest tattletales of the party. That definitely was there in C.S. Lewis's work, and then it getting put into a different world perspective in Orwell, but very similar. It just makes sense. So that kind of explains a lot of the things that maybe why I didn't like it specifically, or things that I just felt like fell flat. But that doesn't mean it's a bad book. That doesn't mean it's ill written. I think that overall ease of reading, like if it was on a Hemingway scale, be considered pretty well written. It's very easy to understand. The writing is fine. That's why it's easy to assign to high schoolers, I think. Except for like several times where Orwell decides to use very unnecessary words that I can't remember because I didn't bother to look them up when I read it, because I was like, I'm not going to go look this up because you decided to add a silly adjective here. I'm just going to skip that and understand it from the context. Aside from all that, though, some positives of this book that helped me to at least hang on for about maybe 7/8 of the book, probably the first good chunk, most of it, except for like the last 2 chapters. Some of the good parts, the idea about language and how language can alter thought, that is very impressive that he noticed that. Obviously, that did not pan out the way it is. Language has multiplied. Language has not narrowed the way that Orwell thought it would, which again, he thought that because of his context within history, within the 2 world wars that had just taken place. The minusculization, I guess, of language in his book did not pan out, but his insight that looking at language and changing language does change the way people think, and little tidbits here and there about that and the main character's thoughts and other characters' lines of dialogue. That is interesting, and that was actually really insightful of him, because language is a huge part of our world, and it's not something that people a lot of times think about when they think about thought control, how language has everything to do with that. That's a whole Derrida culture lecture right there. So you could expand on that if you wanted to, but that was insightful. That was really that kind of did make a little bit of the gruesome grit of the story kind of worth dragging through. Also, the insight that there's so much similarity, and maybe this could deserve another whole video essay or something. The similarity between paranoia and the fear of a big other sort of person, this is of course Žižek language. If you want to understand more about that, you're gonna have to go to Trey's channel. Trey does an excellent job explaining these things. But this idea about this big omniscience other, the they, that sort of is always peering down on you, and how it's so funny that Orwell was able to, I think, pretty distinctly show the similarity between that and being in love, or the fear of no longer having one's feelings when one is in love reciprocated. That was really genius. That's why the first half of the book, I think I actually did read it, or start to try to read it, when I was in high school or somewhere thereabouts, and I was stuck around for that part. I actually really distinctly remembered that was really interesting, that first part, and of course once it actually all takes place, it's kind of milk toast, and it just spirals. They didn't need to get bludgeoned by the thought police for that love story to kind of lose its savor, for me at least. But I think that was very ingenious. So those 2 things were actually really well thought out, and I really appreciated that about 1984. So I'm trying to think right now if there's a third thing, if there is something else that I can think of. Maybe I'll make another video, or do another video maybe expanding on one of those points that Orwell did get pretty well. Overall, wasn't that impressed with the world building, but hey, it was really important for its time. Maybe it just wasn't my thing, but if you haven't read it yet and you want to peer through, I'll tell you it's at least worth the first 6 to 7 chapters just for the little love interest thing, because that's just a funny observation, how similar one's thoughts are when one is in fear of being watched by an invisible enemy, and when one is worried that your crush may or may not still like you after a week of not speaking to her. That's just human emotion. So that was an interesting little thing. So it might be worth at least that. But overall, just an interesting concept of the book. I was surprised that it wasn't everything that it was supposed to be. I guess from hearing everybody talk about how the world is this book, and reading it and seeing how, no, I guess we don't really worry too much about who our neighbors fall in love with. That's not something that we usually bother with. But it's a piece of history. Sometimes you just got to drag yourself through those things a good bit to know whether it's worth it or not for you. But if you did get anything out of this video, hopefully it was just the interesting insights about language and about feelings of love and hatred. It's always very, those are very interesting worlds. And of course, if you disagree vehemently, please leave a comment and tell me why I'm a stupid liberal, maybe, for not understanding how relevant it is. You're absolutely free to do that in the comments because, of course, we don't live in 1984, so I guess we can all disagree about that at least. But still really great. Great getting to familiarize myself with it. Orwell's just an interesting person. And, if you hadn't heard about the C.S. Lewis books, I'm definitely going to have to do a video about that in the future because that, to me, is much more out of the ordinary, much more niche. And hopefully that would be something that maybe somebody out here hasn't read yet, and we can get into that on a later installment or whatever you want to call these things. But anyways, you guys have a great rest of your day. I hope you guys got something out of this.